Welcome, everyone, back to the Label Paranormal Podcast, the podcast that we touch on everything labeled paranormal. I'm your host, Tom Conway. Mark is actually out. He's away. Good for him. It's his birthday, and he is on a little trip out west. So good for him. Hopefully he has a good time, but the show must go on, as they say. And I have another wonderful episode and an even more wonderful guest. Ben Stimpson is an integrative therapist, spiritual director, author, podcaster, and scholar of folklore and history. Ben hosts a weekly podcast called Essence with Ben Stimpson, where he interviews fellow authors, spiritual practitioners in the field of neo-paganism, traditional witchcraft, and folklore. And that is the topic that we want to touch on today, paganism and witchcraft. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Ben. Ben, thank you so much for being on my show. Why don't you give a little bit about your background, what you're doing now, and I guess what got you interested in all of this fun stuff?
Ooh, so my whole biography then, okay. So a lot of people in the neo-paganism world are starting to get know who I am. I just recently put out a book through Llewellyn on ancestor work, and we can talk a little bit more about that later on. But I've been part of the pagan world for about 20 years. I was really there at the beginning of the internet when the internet started to become really big in most people's homes. I was on some of the major online kind of pagan spaces back then, and a lot of people in my cohort, mid-30s to mid-40s, we were all really in the same kind of fields. We were starting to engage online, talk about some of these things, and really connect in. And then here we go, 20 years later, many of us are authors in the same field. So it's kind of a unique thing. But I think most of the people listening to this show may know what neo-paganism is. Those who don't, it's a set of revival traditions that have evolved over the past, say, 70 years and are looking back to ancient pagan pre-Christian traditions. Many are connected in with things like the occult, like theosophy, with spiritualism, things like that, Fox Sisters, really part of that kind of magical counterculture. New Age is also part of that too, and I know that there's also crossovers with paranormal. A lot of like ghost hunters end up having those connections with modern practitioners of witchcraft, and actually quite a few of the authors of my publisher are writing on like laying ghosts, and I'm trying to think what his name is. Oh, it's terrible. Oh, it just went out of my head. But one of the big people from A&E just published with Llewellyn, so that's kind of exciting. Daryl Masters, there we go. Daryl Masters,
there we go.
Yeah, just came out with one. So really a lot of crossovers and linkages. So how I originally got involved with it was I'm originally from the UK. I came over to Canada when I was 8 years old, and when I was starting to look at kind of magic and folklore, you have to understand a lot of the kids' shows back then were really geared towards things like King Arthur and a lot of like the older magical legends, right? And around that time, Harry Potter also became a big thing. And I mean, imagine me, a little 12-year-old, when Harry Potter really, like the first movie came out, I had a scar on my forehead, glasses, and an accent, right? So it's kind of bound to follow me, right? So I started to experiment. People about 10 years older than me, their big thing was the craft. My big thing was things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, practical magic was a big thing for me. And then I just became involved. And then over the years, I explored Eastern spirituality. I ended up going to school and then actually finishing a BA recently on religious studies and
Congrats.
and medieval studies. Thank you. It was a good direction for me, and so that really reinvigorated my interest in kind of the practice side, the actual like practice of magic, but also the cultural exploration of that folklore tradition too, and the two are really connected right now. So I'm both a practitioner and I'm also a scholar of this, and I'm currently working on a few projects for a publisher on the folklore of witchcraft, which is really cool.
Wow. So jack of many trades inside that realm. I definitely appreciate that. It's nice to, spread your wings and touch on a bunch of different things in there. And I also have to give you credit because that you are the first person to mention Buffy the Vampire Slayer on the show. So you get credit for that. You'll be in the Hall of Fame.
I'm absolutely shocked.
Well, me too. And frankly, a little disappointed. But so that's a wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your background and all
Yeah.
of that. So I guess let's start in the beginning, the history of paganism and witchcraft. And we have a lot of listeners and viewers from inside the United States where their world of witchcraft is strictly late 1600s in Salem, Massachusetts. And I think
Mhm.
there's a little bit more than just that. So if you could, please, if you could just go into the history of that for some of our guests and listeners.
Of course. So I think what we have to do is differentiate different streams that are often lumped
Okay.
all together. So
Okay.
when it comes to the history of it, so we have to go back to another one of my minors that I was studying, which is classical history. You go back to kind of even really the early forms of Christianity. The worldview was magical thinking. People
Mm-hmm.
believed and still believe that we can affect the world around us through a ritual, through magic, through sorcery, through a religious ritual, right? The two cousins, they're siblings in many ways.
Okay.
Religion and magical practice both operate on the same mindset. What occurred is that throughout the past 2,000 years, that train has continued. It's just been utilizing different modalities. So a lot of the medieval, a lot of my focus in my medieval studies is on lived religious folk tradition. And folk tradition is really where you start to see a lot of what we would eventually call witchcraft evolve in. That was compared to then the high ceremonial occult magic of what we would think of like grimoires. So when you think of modern traditions like Thelema or the Golden Dawn, Aleister Crowley, versus say Gerald Gardner, you're looking at really not Gerald Gardner's not a good example of that. Like Sybil Leek, for example. Really a big
Okay.
name in places like Salem, Massachusetts right now. You've got these two streams. You've got the folk, the natural magic, and then you've got the ceremonial magic. So throughout the Middle Ages, those were a big thing. People they would be going down to the church. They would be maybe scratching little inscriptions into the church because that was a place of power. And there was a belief there that that power would then translate into their regular lives. That was just a normal, natural part of of everyday living. Starting in the 1500s, we then start to see a shift. You start to see Protestantism start to take over. You started to see the witch craze start to take over. And you have to understand, in that time period, what we're really talking about here is a differentiation between the wise people, the natural magic that everybody was doing, and witchcraft. Witchcraft was always negative. Witchcraft wasn't something that you were, like you weren't a witch, you were doing witchcraft, and witchcraft was always negative. So somebody could be practicing cunning craft, which is a huge, it's an academic term, very based in like English language there, but it describes a whole tradition that seems to be in most of Europe at this time, which is the village wise person, the village wise man or wise woman, right? You would go and they were serving the population by being midwives, by being the kind of the barber surgeons of that time, right? You would go and get your tooth out from these people. They would also then be finding out if you had been bewitched. So if somebody was believing that they were bewitched by an evil witch, what they would do is they would go and get a counterspell performed by these wise people. And that whole tradition carried on through until probably the early to mid 1800s. We don't have it in our modern day now because of various reasons. But that tradition, that cunning craft tradition, is often what we think of when we think of like magic and the village wise man. Starting in the 1800s, that whole tradition started to die off. Now, that tradition in itself can be found all over the world. It was carried with colonialism over to North America. And so when people talk about things like Appalachian granny magic or Pennsylvanian hexenbrut, right? These like, conjuremen or hoodoo folk, right? Hoodoo is definitely part of that kind of overarching tradition of folk tradition. You start to see then, people would just go and visit these people. That starts to die off in the 1800s because of industrialization, because of people moving away from their regular areas that they came from to go and work elsewhere, mass migration and whatnot, and the disruption of small village life to bigger centers. And then by the 1900, it's eliminated. But what's happened in that is a new wave has come up, which is spiritualism, right? The channeling, the tabletop, the people that we would think of as clairvoyants now, right? Mediums, right?
Mm-hmm.
That has started to evolve around the mid of the 1850s and onwards. And then that becomes the next wave of this, like a new face of this older tradition, right? Instead of going to the village wise woman who's going to read your tarot cards, you go to a spirit medium who's going to channel that information for you, right? And then from that started to evolve and become what we have today, which is the modern psychic fair circuit, right? In that time frame, though, what was happening was you had a huge number, both in North America and in Europe, a huge number of people who were very interested. These were mostly academics. These were mostly people of the middle class. They were really interested in those folk traditions that were starting to die off. And that's where we start to get things like, I'll show you, things like the folklore books on witchcraft, right? So if you open up any of these old folklore books, you'll have these stories of, the wise man who's battling the evil witch or something like that, right? You get these stories in there of going and visiting the Yarb doctor or the wart doctor or the cow charmer, or these people who are going to be, really connected with rustic lifestyle, which didn't exist. They were all dying off by this time, and they weren't transmitting their information down. So these folklorists, these middle-class people were really interested. These were also the people who were then connecting in with the occult and the idea of ceremonial magic. At this time, we start to see a real pushback against against the church. We start to see a lot more people become more secular, and so then we start to see generations of new people taking these older traditions on, reinventing them for those times. And then we start to see the rise of witchcraft as we would know it now, which is Gerald Gardner and Wicca. Right. So beginning in the 1950s, when the witchcraft laws were finally repealed in England, suddenly you had these people coming up with various different traditions. One of them looked back to the old cunning folk who really go back to the Middle Ages. And then Gerald Gardner was really connected in with the occult, the ceremonial magicians, and also the Orientalism of that time. Around the 1850s, 60s, you start to get very interest in this kind of middle range in Eastern philosophy. So you start to see people who are translating ancient, Hindu texts and Buddhist texts. You start to see the rise of a Theosophical Society with Alcott and Blavatsky, who were really connected in with spiritualists, right? All of these different groups really interconnected, really weaving what we would eventually know as today as the New Age, right? So a lot of the New Age from the 1960s and 70s had their roots in the 1900s. And then that brings us to today. Publishers who are putting out books on any kind of magic that you can think of and want to think of. In the 1970s, we start to get academics who were really interested in witchcraft studies. So then we started getting people like the prolific Ronald Hutton, Owen Davies, and other places start to look at then witchcraft through that academic lens. And then that's what brings us to right here, right now.
Wow, that's wonderful.
It's a
I
long,
truly appreciate
convoluted
that.
history.
Yes, but what I appreciate is that it's had several facelifts almost, over the time. And
yeah.
What's great about that is I love something that lives in its time and then changes or evolves with the time that it is.
Very much so.
And you don't really see that with most traditional religions and things like that. This is how it is and this is how it'll always be.
Yes.
And you oftentimes, it might be great for first few generations, but after time, it starts to become the square peg in the round hole scenario. So I'm fascinated because I had no idea that the dynamic, it's so dynamic. It changes.
Yeah.
It keeps the core, but it changes how to get to that core over time and what best serves the individuals, right? The best serves who's practicing this. So I completely, have a profound amount of respect for that portion of it.
Absolutely.
So let's talk here a little bit about misnomers, because some might hear the term paganism, some might hear the term Wiccan, witchcraft, New Age, you name it, and think it's evil.
Yes.
How can we enlighten people to know to keep an open mind and not automatically think this is bad, this is evil?
This is something that gets asked a lot, and I don't think your listeners who hold that opinion are going to like this. But I think that it's really important that people who hold an opinion about a tradition that they don't belong to mind their own business. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's not up to us. It's not up to me to convince anybody else of what I do as not being evil. It's none of my business what they think, right? I think what we need to understand is why that viewpoint exists in the first place. Because if we go back, people are very shocked when I tell them and I educate them that magic was actually an integrated part of Christian society. Right? I think a lot of pagans are very shocked when I educate them on the fact that a lot of the rituals and a lot of the magic that they're utilizing now actually comes from Christian Europe and from that Christian mindset. If you go to Appalachia, if you go down into the Ozarks, right, a lot of magic is being performed with the Bible involved. So it's not an us versus them sort of situation. I think that definitely Protestantism has a lot to do with it. I think that Protestantism has created a lot of issues in the world where it is very structured and very us versus them and very, anything that is not of God is evil. If you go back to the medieval age, the understanding of magic was along those lines, and this is why witch, in the kind of the English sense at least, becomes different when you look at Scotland and Wales and other parts of those islands. Witches are with the devil versus the wise folk who are with God, right? Yes. And this is where the whole idea of the astrologers come in, right? Court astrologers all across Europe saw it as a science, even though it was classed as a magical science, because it was utilizing the creation of God. Right? So it was very much aligned with God. It was a way of interpreting what God had created in order to bring us into our own life, right? So nowadays, when people say that's evil, I then have to question what they mean by that, where that's come from for them. I would say that I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. The satanic panic in the United States in the 1980s didn't help. And I think we see this with modern politics. I think modern politics, and not going to modern politics, but I think modern politics shows us how easily a panic can be created for political means. And that has always been the case when it comes to any kind of other, right? So, during the medieval age, it was Jews and perceived witches. In the early modern phase, after Protestantism had taken over parts of Europe, in those areas, then it was Catholics and Jews, right? And then witches, of course. And you see a lot of very similar stories being told about marginalized groups by those who are afraid. Oftentimes it's don't go for the children, right? The rhetoric that we see in some modern politics in some countries around the world today is particularly around don't go after the children. That mirrors a lot of what we see in what was cast against Jews in the medieval ages and witches against and Catholics, right? So whatever marginalized group is being targeted in any age, that tends to be the focus. They're evil, they're not, all of that, right? So it's really not my business to try to convince somebody who holds that point of view that these traditions are not evil. They're not, right?
Yep. Well, thank you, and you're absolutely right about that. If you were to ask me what emotion should dominate the planet Earth, and you would say love, right? Yes. But if you ask me what actually does, I would say fear. And,
Yeah.
fear is something that makes us hate something without even knowing it,
Yes.
because when you don't know something and whoever gets to you first, you're going to believe that guy. It's like the first person to tell you something. You believe them more than you believe
Yeah.
the second guy, just because they were first and not necessarily because they were true.
This is the thing.
So,
Yeah.
in that aspect, yes, something new, something that you don't understand is going to lead to fear. And when it leads to fear, all it takes is the first person to get to you, and then you're going to believe that. So I totally understand that aspect of it. But one thing that I've noticed in research for this podcast and talking
Mm-hmm.
to you is that this field is growing now more so than it has in the past, with the current generation. What do you have to say about that?
Absolutely. So, it's an interesting anthropological phenomenon, and I think
Okay.
that it makes a lot of sense when you understand perhaps why it's happening. So, on the one hand, whenever we see, going back to this idea of a new face,
Mm-hmm.
whenever witchcraft or magic or a counterculture comes up, it's
Mm-hmm.
often remodeled based on the needs of the people in that present time, right?
True.
So I'll
Yeah.
give you a very good example. So among my cohort, so I'm a queer person, among my
Mm-hmm.
cohort of writers, and the majority of my guests actually on my own podcast, and I'm up to something like 70 episodes right now.
Okay.
Most of the writers in traditional
Congrats again.
witchcraft. Oh, thank you so much. Well, I originally started it because my book was coming out, and the author community really welcomed me in. But it's
And it just
funny
stuck.
because it's just, and I'm
Yeah.
there. I make friends now through my podcast. It's horrible, but but it's one of those things, very particular things now. So a lot of them are in their mid-30s. A lot of them grew up on the same material. A lot of them are
Yes.
queer, right? A lot of them are identifying very similar ways. And what does witchcraft do? Well, originally it was to give us our own power back, right? Being
Mm-hmm.
marginalized people,
Mm-hmm.
like suddenly coming out of these like really patriarchal traditions, what did witchcraft or paganism offer us? Well, it offered us a space, a safe space that we could explore ourselves through. And I think that often is like the same with other forms of alternative spirituality. It is offering people a different way of living that is perhaps healthier. Oftentimes it doesn't become healthy, but oftentimes it does, right? It depends on how that individual is interacting with it. But I think we see that when we look at the vast history of it, right? If you go back to the 1900s, very early 1900s, and you go to the Atlantis bookstore, which is one of the oldest metaphysical bookstores in London, you're looking at who's hanging out in that store. They're very similar personalities to who are hanging out in modern metaphysical shops, right? They're
Mm-hmm.
counterculturalists, they're artists, they're writers. A lot of them are nationalists. A lot of them like kind of part of those nationalistic movements of marginalized peoples in certain places, like Scottish nationalism or Welsh nationalism, Irish nationalism, right? So a lot of younger people who are interested in ideas, interested in reshaping the world so that they can find themselves in it, right? We tend to see that. In the 1970s with the goddess movement, for example, which is another big stream, a new like kind of face of paganism in the 1970s, you see the feminism movement taking over that particular time frame. And what is the emphasis? Looking at goddesses, looking at new ways of seeing themselves in the divine, right? You go
Mm-hmm.
forward a few and you come into the punk era where everything is being thrown out the window, and then you see the rise of chaos magic. So chaos magic and Satanism, Levian Satanism, in the 1980s really was connected in with that punk movement and that, again, countercultural need to find a new expression, right? So it's kind of an interesting thing. I think that a lot of people find power through it, but a lot of, and speaking as a therapist here on this, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people can also find bypass through it too. So people who are coming from a place of religious trauma, right, may have grown up in a very evangelical Baptist, what have you, home where their lives were restricted.
Yeah.
And if they don't fit that mold, then who are they suddenly? So what do? They find a tradition that is going to give them that dopamine fix.
Mm-hmm.
And make themselves feel better in the moment without having to deal with that trauma. That's where the whole bypass things come in. So I don't want to sit here and just pretend it's all wonderful and good. There's a lot of bypass in it too. But I think eventually people get to a place where they own their tradition. And what's happening now, I think, again, new face, we're starting to see a lot of people merging their Christianity of their origin, their original families, with this magic, refinding folklore connected to that, so that they can bring both parts of themselves into their practice. And I think that's a way of owning the tradition for themselves.
Oh, wow. So a melding of the two
Yep.
to fill both parts of what they're looking for, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
That's great. And I always am a fan of people finding things out on their own. You can obviously give somebody the answer, but when they come to the answer themselves, it's a lot more powerful, and it's better for them, because knowledge without sacrifice, well, there's the old adage for that, right? So,
Yep.
we it's not so much that you get to the answer, it's the journey on how you got there too. So I really love the fact that they can bring both into their own reality, their own consciousness,
Absolutely.
and make an argument for both, because sometimes we are too. It's this or that, not this and that. And, I appreciate people taking steps out of there, because the more traditional based religions are, again, this, and that's it. And so I love the people that do question that. So thank you for that again, Ben. So let me ask you this. There's, John Smith listening to this podcast, hearing you talk about this, they are getting interested. They're like, I might want to learn more about it. Talk to that person, and how would you explain to that person how to get more involved?
Oh, I've been involved for such a long time now that it's difficult for me to, and I get that asked a lot. My answer to that was writing a book, right? So what I always do is I have a list of books that I feel are really good introductory, like really good introductions.
Yeah.
But those books can become out of date very, very quickly. And we see that. As the tide changes, as trends come in, right? As people are hooked for different reasons. Whenever a new TV show comes out, and suddenly whatever's in that TV show is like a draw, it's like there's something interesting about that. The reality can be a lot more boring than the TV show, right? So I feel like, there's multiple ways to do it. Go into a local metaphysical store, start talking to people. There's pagan pride days that people can attend. What has been really fulfilling for me is getting involved with actual community. There's a lot of community spaces out there for these traditions. There's a lot of people online. There are podcasts. There are influencers. All of this. But I think that beginning, it becomes a little dangerous, because anybody who doesn't know anything about something can be taken in very, very easily by somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about. And this is the issue with the internet. It's suddenly given anybody a platform. And I'm sure you see that when it comes to UFOs, other paranormal, right?
Absolutely.
It becomes dangerous, right? You see these influencers who are going on ghost hunts, and they have no clue what they're doing. And what they're doing is just watching television shows and be like, oh yeah, I can go and entrap a ghost. And it's like, come on, dude, what are you doing, right? Anyways, sorry, that's the whole other thing.
No, you're exactly right. I totally feel that. And this is what, and viewers and listeners have heard me say this, and I'll say it again, and I'll say it as many times as I have to. We in the paranormal community have to be more skeptical than the skeptics. We have to be our worst critic, because there's a lot, and I mean a lot, of us out there that will fake a video. That will tell you to go into that, to lead somebody who's green, who's an amateur, in without any kind of spiritual protection, into a ghost hunt, and then that allows for attachments or possessions or things like that. And basically, they just want to charge, okay, 10 ahead, and I'll take you in here. You know what I mean? Like something like that. And it's oftentimes counterproductive, because if you get that bad taste in your mouth the first time, you are never coming back. You're done. Back. I don't want to do it anymore. I hated it. And that's not what it's about. It's about the community. Again, just like how you were talking about your community, it's about the community coming together and talking about all of this weird stuff, because when you have a community, you have protection against misinformation. You have an area where you can talk about the craziest ideas you had and be pulled
Absolutely.
back in or encouraged to go on that route, right? We all have had wonderful ideas, and we've all had ideas that are way far out there, and you had to be reeled back in, right? None of us are perfect. We had to think about and be corrected with our community. Now, again, if you're corrected by the wrong person, you never want to talk about it again. I'm shutting down. I'm turning in. I'm turtling. Um, it's seen and evidenced everywhere, not just in our communities. It's seen in in commonplace everywhere outside at work.
Yeah.
Let somebody say a bad idea at work, and now they don't want to speak up for the rest of the time they're there, and now they feel like they're not a part of the inside. It's crazy how, but that's also human psychology. That's human psyche. That's us.
So.
We're meant to be around others. We're meant to be in a community. We're meant to be not isolated. And I think that's wonderful. Bringing it back to the question, I think that's wonderful. What you said is that get involved with a community. Don't be that one who wants to learn and I'll research everything and pretend I know everything. Do your time. Get in with a community. Ask a question that might make somebody laugh, but then hopefully that person will explain, no, that you didn't know. That's okay. Here's how, let me explain. You come in and you think it's about casting spells and hocus pocus and things like that, and you're taught, hey, no, this is about a community of this religion. I'm taking you this way. If you guide them peacefully through that, you've made an ally for life instead of laughing at their original idea, right?
Yes.
I think that's
no, it's true.
I think it's very important. Sorry, go ahead.
No, well, and so this is the thing. I was very lucky because I had connections with really marginalized traditions. So I actually lived for 2 years with a priest of Oshun for a Oshun is a goddess Orisha in the Lukumi tradition coming out of Cuba. So Santeria, that whole tradition of Santeria that we know of, call it in the West, is actually called Lukumi. And that goes way back to the African traditions before the slave trade, right? So I was really involved for 2 very intense years with this lived tradition. We had spirits living in the house with us, right? His tutelary orishas were there, right? And in that tradition, it's a village-based tradition. So, I think this is where modernity is really starting to F us up, because you can go onto the internet and meet anybody and everybody. And if you don't have that sense of community, you don't have those organic checks and balances in place. In the village in Cuba, if you come in and say, I'm the high priest of la la la, right? Nobody knows who you are. They will literally take a beating stick and beat you out of the village because they don't want you there, right? It's true. I'm not even lying, right? Like old school priests, old school Cuban priests who meet younger, people coming into the religion that get out of line, will take and beat the crap out of them for their insolence, right? And I'm not there to say, like, go and beat people out. But I think that modernity in North America, that entitlement, that sense of me, that individualism, has caused a lot of issues when it comes to all of these traditions, because the idea is, I want to learn magic, I want to learn this, I want to do this, and I want to do it all. And somebody said the other day online, and I really respected what they said. They said something along the lines of, in the modern witchcraft movement, we don't have elders anymore, we have experts. Right? And that's the same for your traditions, right? That's the same for any of the paranormal kind of, sphere, right? We have experts. And the problem with experts is that because of the way of social media now, right? You're constantly needing to create content, constantly need to get out there, put your face out there, because you'll just be a face in a sea of other faces, right? You have to make yourself seen. Is that people are then becoming experts in things that they wouldn't normally do, right? And then it becomes dangerous, because then it's the creeping in of the, I'm going to teach on things I don't know anything about. What
Mm-hmm.
we're also seeing, and unfortunately this is something that the author community has a lot of thoughts on, is that we occasionally get people who are coming in from other places around the world, or people who are of a certain background, and they don't have any real links. This is particularly true for African traditions. People who are coming in and stating, I am initiated in so-and-so, or I have this background, or I practice this shamanic background from Venezuela, for example. And when you actually piece it together and look really, like those of us who actually know what they're talking about and look closer, you can tell that they're bullshitting and that they're lying. But they're relying on the ignorance of the masses outside of those contexts.
Yeah.
We see this with Peruvians, like Peruvian shamans who come up. Somebody once said to me from Peru, from down that way, they said, why would a Peruvian shaman need to go to North America to find clients? Why? Because they've been kicked out of Peru. They can't operate in Peru because their elders would get a switch and beat the shit out of them, right?
Yeah.
So it's one of
Makes
those
sense.
things of like misrepresentation. And this is what makes it really especially dangerous for people who are coming into these traditions. I'll give you an example. TikTok, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bane of witchcraft, bane of the paranormal community. Like the whole, we're going to hex the fae. Right?
Yeah.
Or we're going to go and do like ghost hunts. I saw one once where they were going in and they were trying to do the whole Warren thing, which was to just, remove and clear out a house. And the ghosts that were in there, the spirits that were in there, had built the house. Like, you're really going to enter somebody else's house and remove them? Like, how disconnected are you? But they didn't know what they were doing because they were only looking at other TikTokers. Right. So there's a lot to it. I would say, again, coming back to the central question, meet as many people as you can. Be open to hearing criticism. Be open to getting a lay of the land. And there are some wonderful books out there that will explain kind of what all of these different streams are. But don't just then assume that you know it all. It's a lifelong thing.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better. I mean, that goes for any community. You have to be humbled, and you can't go in there with an ego that I know everything. Listen more than you talk. I think that's the central theme.
Yeah,
Ben, I want to say thank you so much for being on this wonderful podcast. I really appreciate it. I've personally learned a lot. I know our audience has. So again, I'm going to turn it over to you. Please promote anything you like. Talk about your wonderful books and where people can find you. The floor is yours.
So absolutely. So everything's on benstimson.com. Talk about branding myself there. But yeah, so I'm a therapist. I'm taking clients. I work a lot with people in the queer community. I also work a lot with people in the kind of alternative spirituality community. People who have had experiences, and they are genuine experiences. They're not a form of mental health disorder and or symptom. And they need a space that they can talk about that sort of stuff. That's where the spiritual direction piece comes in. One of my first book is Ancestral Whispers, a guide to ancestral veneration practices. That is learning how to work with the familial dead, as opposed instead of going and doing ghost hunts and paranormal investigations and things like that. It's actually learning how do you build a lived spiritual practice with the dead, and how do you work with death in that way through various rituals. I also teach. I've got a Patreon with all sorts of classes on it. People can have access to if they want, and I'm speaking on all sorts of different things. One of my big projects I'm working on right now is a source book for witch lore from the 1500s all the way to the present day for the UK. So England and Wales particularly, and that's coming out at some point in 2025. So benstimson.com, that's where everything is.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful having you, and everyone listening. Yes, go support Ben, and hopefully we can have you back on in the future.
I'd love to. Thank you very much.
Excellent. And for everyone listening out there, thank you for listening to Labeled Paranormal Podcast. You can find us on all the major streaming platforms where you get your podcast, and also video on YouTube. Leave us a comment, review, 5 stars, drop us a like, anything, please. It really helps us. And until next time, everyone, be safe and take care of each other. Bye, everybody.